Today's module consists of 2 parts and a case study. In the first part, I will give an introduction to what Foresight is and how we work with it in the HBP and more generally at the Danish Board of Technology. After that, there is a short reflection exercise before Aline Salas, Deputy Lead on Responsible Research and Innovation, takes over to introduce neuroethical anticipation in Foresight. I'll begin with an introduction to Foresight before I'll show you a practical example, and I will also give you the introduction to the case study. So welcome to the module on Foresight, an introduction to Foresight as a method for technology assessment. So what is Foresight? Foresight is not about predicting the future, but it's the practice of anticipating on possible futures. So it's really important that the aim is about trying to do this anticipation on possible futures and assessing where we could be heading at the moment, where many different futures are possible, versus where we would actually like to be going, and what we could do and should do to get there. And it's about recognizing uncertainties in the present, that there are these many possible futures, but also that we are directed somehow by past developments and entrenched developments, investments. Still, we don't know what will materialize in the end, and then trying to go about trying to imagine these possible futures in a structured way. In our practice, we focus on desirable futures and also on identification of values and needs related to these desirable futures. And therefore, this thing about anticipating possible futures also implies becoming aware of possible ethical and social challenges related to different possible futures, and together with this, related technical and scientific challenges that could influence the direction of challenge, but not only challenges, but also opportunities that could influence where we're going with relation to our current development. And Foresight for the best possible assessment should be a collective practice where one takes into account knowledge, experience, and assessments from different groups, from different kinds of experts with different backgrounds and different knowledges, all the way to lay citizens, so that Foresight practice is a collective anticipatory practice to practice this anticipation of possible futures and to plan actions in attempting to steer the present. Now, there are many methodological approaches to Foresight, and I've listed some of them here. So just really to be clear, that what I'm talking about today is this last bullet point, Foresight as part of technology assessment practices, and hopefully through my examples it will become clear what that is. So I'm not touching upon so much methods like Delphi studies, horizon scanning, or backcasting. I will come into a little bit about scenarios, but not scenario planning as such, but really focusing on Foresight as part of this technology assessment practice. So we call this structured or informed speculation, and what is really important is that this speculation or thinking about the future, possible futures, is based on some theory or knowledge about patterns of change. And so thinking about possible futures need to be based both in an analysis of the present day, but also on historical developments and patterns, and it needs to be informed by theories of social and technical and moral change, since, as I said earlier, we are also focused on identifying ethical and social challenges in order to paint what would be desirable futures. And as I said also, in addition, it's necessary to then get an input and involve a broad range of experts and affected groups, including often also publics, to be as informed as possible when you engage yourself in these kind of speculative exercises about possible futures. So the first step in beginning to thinking about the future in a structured way is building on some theory about social change. And here I would like to introduce you to what is called the multi-level model on technological transitions. It's a model for thinking about how change happens and thinking about that in a structured way. And so this model can help us think about how our present realities are structured. That helps us then also to understand how and what could initiate change and what factors we could adjust or could be adjusted to imagine possible future pathways. But first, a little bit about the model. So in this multi-level model, innovative change is understood as happening across multiple levels. And basically, the model theorizes that our social order is structured on these three interwoven levels of organization. And the highest level, and the one that is typically most resistant to change, is the landscape level. And that is the one that forms the backdrop to the two other levels. And, or you could say that within the landscape level we find these other levels nested, the regime and the niche level. And the socio-technical regimes, as they're called, are really where everyday practice takes place. And these regimes, they are centered on a social technology practice. So they are centered on a technology or technological design, like for example smartphones, airplanes for different purposes, trains, etc. And then on the associated social practices that are needed to operate and maintain this socio-technical infrastructure. And then a niche related to such a regime is anywhere where the normal way of going about life and practices in this regime is challenged, or where experimentation is happening, trying to change dominant design and the associated social practices. Like, to give an example, think about, for example, the smartphone, where one could say we are in a regime at the moment that is stabilizing on mobile phones from previously having been organized around landline phones. So today hardly anyone has a landline phone anymore, and that's a transition that has been ongoing over the last 20-30 years. Before that we had a really stable regime around the use of landline phones. And so with that change has also, happened a change in our social practices and the support infrastructures for landlines versus mobile phones. And changes have also been happening around our norms, ethics of interaction, and behaviors that have also changed as a result of this regime change. So as I said, this model is a way of thinking about change and thinking about the context in which change happens, and what can and what could influence possible directions of change. And so just to put it here on the slide, what the different levels consist of. The landscape, the most stable one, is where you find mega trends or let's say stable, more or less larger sort of infrastructural developments like automation, electrification, computation, forms of governance, sort of in a simple way how our societies are ordered, like the bigger structures that give stability of some form to our societies. And then nested within these landscapes, as I said, the socio-technical regimes that are enacted and shared through practice, reproducing dominant technological designs. And then the associated social practices that are held together by what you could call shared cognitive rules, so shared thinking in terms of, what are the problems that we are solving with this technological design, why are we designing it in the way that we're doing, what directions do we think we should follow in the future, what knowledge do we see as relevant, and what sort of normative and ethical beliefs have we built into the social practice that is part of realizing this dominant technological design. And the niche, anywhere where there is experimentation, innovation happening in terms of trying to do things differently. And regimes can be really stable and resistant to change. So when change happens, and innovations that are, or experimentation that is happening in niches find a way to link up with a regime and starts to change practices and thinking about like what the best design is and what problems to solve and with what knowledge and challenging normative and ethical beliefs. It's often in combination with what's called landscape pressures or shocks, major crises like, for example, a pandemic or a war that can push to these dominant logics of governance, for example, what's sources of energy to use, or consumer combined with consumers or activist pressures, and that can create really windows, what's called windows of opportunity for change in this multi-level model. So another example I would like to show you how one could use this model to think about possible futures. Because I've taken this example on genetic susceptibility testing, or the question about if genetic susceptibility testing is something that is part of a possible future. This is an article from 2010, but it's a pretty nice piece that's in terms of trying to understand how one could use this model. So I've put the reference here as well. And so this example tries to think about possible future practices of susceptibility testing by taking as a starting point the Dutch context of testing for hereditary genetic heart disease. So you have here, in terms of genetic testing, a landscape level where there are some, let's say, long-standing agreements on what kind of moral principles and human and ethical theories under which we do such a thing as genetic testing for hereditary disease. This is nested in a landscape of human rights, something we jointly agree that we would like to adhere to, norms in healthcare are about doing no harm, doing good, about respecting the autonomy of the individual and working within well-established moral frameworks of consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. Then at the regime level, there's a dominant technological design or specific opportunity for genetic testing that has over the years formed, let's say, what's possible in terms of genetic testing, rules and procedures for how you enact that, using, for example, informed consent that is really entrenched in a social practice. And then you have a niche level development, so experimentations with new technological approaches to genetic testing that could make testing cheaper, faster, that could test more mutations that are less hereditary, more sort of probability testing in terms of, you might get something. So this is susceptibility testing in the future. And these new technological opportunities question the practices that are ongoing, introduces questions such as, should more people be offered these tests? Should we change our social practices around genetic testing? Should we build our healthcare systems to be more preventative for larger groups of patients? And that together creates a dynamic around which one can then try to explore what could be possible in terms of future developments. And this is one way in which one can use this multi-level model to try to think about future opportunities. So the key point here is that with these new technological opportunities for genetic testing, so doing it faster, cheaper, for less hereditary variants, the technology design, social practice, and morality sort of co-evolve. There's change happening at all levels. There are some entrenchments in genetic testing, some traditions in terms of how we do things, some really strong practices, like, for example, building genetic testing around informed consent, that will shape both the technological options but also social practices. But key point is that these can change. And so this multi-level model here is really a resource for thinking about possible futures in this domain and in many others. But this is a concrete example that you can look up also to get maybe some inspiration for how to think about it in your own area of practice. And so, in addition to this multi-level model, I would also like to share another approach to thinking about possible futures. And this is an approach in technology assessment that looks at visions and expectations to future technologies. And it asks questions about their plausibility at 3 levels. And the first level is questions about the technological vision of how something will work. Second level is questions about social usability. And the third level about moral desirability of a vision or expectations to a development. So to go a bit more into the details of asking questions about the technological feasibility, these are, oftentimes when there is a vision or an expectation to how a technology will perform in the future, one makes some claims about like how it will function, what kind of characteristics the technology will have. And then on the background of that, one can start asking questions. So, for example, one type of questions to ask are like who are like presenting these visions, what's the background, so who and why are they telling us this, why are they saying the technology will develop in a certain direction, what could their motivations be, and then second type of questions that one can start asking is going into the settings where the technology is developed and becoming part of discussions in the innovation space to get access to discussions about how the technology is working or could be working, what kind of uncertainties are there, what kind of discussions are the engineers having, what choices, what trade-offs are made in developing the technology, and how does that relate to the visions and expectations and the claims about technological feasibility made there. Then at the second level, questions about social usability. So here, often in visions and expectations to a future of a technology, claims are made about how it will be used in society, how it will be adopted, how it will be integrated in different social practices. And then the first level, you can ask questions about, what are the existing social practices and norms? And how does this vision of the technology fit? And what would need to change? Are there some professions, for example, where responsibilities would change, where they would need to do things differently, or they would need to surrender maybe some of their professional expertise to a technology? How would that be received? So those are questions to ask at the first level. And the second level, it comes, then these questions about how does that affect distributions of responsibility? How does it affect institutions? Are there logistical challenges to be solved? Infrastructural challenges, cultural norms? What about user preferences? What do they prefer? What kind of needs do they have? How does the technology live up to those needs? Would we need to do things differently than today, and how would that be received? What kind of challenges could you imagine related to that? And then at the third level of questions are about the desirability of the technology. So how desirable is this vision actually? And this concerns claims about the social needs that is being addressed with this technology. And so this is about asking questions to values and norms in the future vision, going for example outside of the developer group to patient groups policy, and asking them about how they understand this vision, how desirable do they think it is, what kind of need is addressed or not addressed according to them, what is good, what kind of questions could they have to a function, who would control results, is portability, like of a measuring device, for example, a good thing or a bad thing, and according to who. So that will give you a good idea of how the desirability of the technology will be judged in different settings and by different groups, and how they are likely to receive it. And also there, in terms of desirability, trying to think through the second level about alternative uses. So what else could the technology be used for? Can it be misused? Are there any coverage issues, any challenges in terms of how it could maybe discriminate or lead to biases that haven't yet been well thought through? So all of these are questions that can be used to examine visions and expectations to the future of a technology. And then one can use an exploration of these kind of questions to build scenarios, small vignettes, to explore those questions even further, trying to imagine the technological function, social usability, and moral desirability in specific contexts of use. And then these scenarios, they can be used to start discussions about the desirability of certain futures, and then what directions we would prefer development to take, and then in the end to identify and undertake action to realize the futures that we prefer. So I would like to show you an example from a project that we did on nanotechnologies, where we developed such short vignettes to discuss or to show possible futures, possible future use contexts of nanotechnologies in different areas. This one is about the healthcare area, and these possible future scenarios were developed to aid in discussions about desirable futures and raise awareness about possible ethical and societal challenges, as well as social dynamics that could influence usability or open up questions about technological functioning of sensors involving nanotechnologies. So on the slide here you can see a link to the video on YouTube. So I would encourage you to either watch the video here, I'm not sure if that's possible for you on the slide, but then otherwise use the link and go to YouTube and watch the video there. And just in case that's not possible for you, I'm going to read out the scenario that's being presented in this video, but if you're going to YouTube and watching it, please, you can skip that part. So it's imagine it's early morning, and we have here Sophia, and she wakes up, turns off her alarm clock, yawns and sits up. It's time to get up. She turns off the flight mode on her phone, turns on the body sensor app, and holds her breath for a few seconds as it updates. She sighs. No signs of cancer yet. It's time for her to go and wake up her children. Since they installed these nanorobot sensors in her breast, it has become a daily routine for Sophia to check the body sensor app first thing in the morning. Sophia's mother died of breast cancer 7 years ago. And it's apparently so that Sophia is also genetically predisposed to develop breast cancer. And these nanorobot sensors were offered to her in order to detect eventual cancer cells as early as possible. And as Sophia is setting the table for breakfast, she thinks about her mother. If only her cancer had developed 5 years later, she would most likely have survived. Because since the development of cancer treatments have been enhanced with nanotechnology, very few die from breast cancer, and no one has to suffer from the terrible side effects of the outdated chemotherapies and radiotherapies of the past. Instead, today they use tiny nanorobots to transport the therapeutic agents directly to the tumor, so that patients do not need to have their entire body bombarded with chemicals and radiation. And these tiny nanosensors are installed in the breast tissue of cancer patients, and they keep track of how they react to treatments. And in this way, doctors can also make adjustments as soon as it's needed and monitor any reoccurrence of tumor cells. Sophia's husband is getting the kids ready, and Sophia sits down with a cup of coffee. She looks at her phone, and she fights the temptation to check the body sensor app. The app is her safety net, but it's also a daily reminder that one day the figures might not be as she hoped. And what if the app doesn't detect everything? What if someone hacks into her phone and changes the settings or read the data? Before the nanosensors were installed, Sophia didn't think much about cancer, but now she thinks about it all the time. Her husband comes in with the kids, and they all sit down to have breakfast, and Sophia feels very grateful to be alive. So this is an example of how we've tried to explore one possible futures of application of nanotechnologies in sensor tech, or in sensors and in an app technology, in a possible future use setting. And this is, from this small vignette, one can discuss, for example, the technology, how this sensor app works, how it is installed, how it is put into a breast tissue, working in an app. Is that feasible? Can it be used in that way, or are there some constraints and challenges of that kind of use for the technology itself? Also, a question about the social usability. So, is this how the users will use the sensors? Is that how it will be adapted into their everyday lives? What could consequences be for users such as Sophia? Does it help her, relieve her from some stress, or does it actually add stress? Are there some features about this technology that could aid or prevent her from using the app? And the questions about desirability and responsibilities. What responsibilities are changing here in terms of monitoring her health, and also responsibility to act, knowing if the measurements are accurate and good. How should that be organized? Should it fall on the user? How should professionals be involved? And for whom is this kind of technological development desirable? Whose needs are addressed? Is it Sophia's, the healthcare system? What is it? Is it about saving money and resources? What about possible misuses or abuses of the technology and Sophia's information? How does this work in terms of prevention of health, or prevention of disease, of course? So, these are some of the questions that you can reflect upon through vignettes such as this one. And there are probably many more questions as well. This is just sort of a start to get you sort of thinking about how to use, or how to think about possible futures, and start discussing desirability, social usability, and technological feasibility as well. And so there are a few more scenarios to show you. We developed several. So another one is about, also in the healthcare area, about the use of this artificial nose, where you breathe into this or blow into this nose, and then it analyzes your breath. And the scenario asks questions about how that should be installed, where, how it could be used. Also, it opens up questions about like health insurance, how well medicines work for different population groups. So this scenario is designed to open up other types of questions. And the third one that we developed, several, with one around, and this is in the energy sector, about future electronic devices. This is a cell phone that is self-powered, and it's developed to not break down and not need replacement. But then the scenario asks questions, for example, about culture and appropriation by users. Can our consumer culture adapt to a future, for example, where devices will last much longer. So is it desirable, or are there actually other sort of adjustments or amendments that we should be thinking about in terms of our use of electronic devices and the environmental questions that come up. So all of this is available on YouTube, and there's also some background information that you can read about how these vignettes were put together if that's something that you would be interested in. Okay, so that was it for this short introduction to Foresight as part of technology assessment practices. Now there's a short reflection exercise. So following this introduction, it's about your thoughts, and this exercise is called the microscope, the mirror, and the binoculars. And the first question for you to reflect upon is on the themes that I introduced in this presentation. So, this idea about trying to think about possible futures, discussing desirable futures, asking questions, and considering all the different dynamics that go into both maintaining the present state of things and also how change comes about. So what are your thoughts on all of these themes in this presentation? Next question is about how this presentation relates or could be related to the work that you are doing yourself. Could you imagine trying to think about possible futures and engaging in discussions, asking questions, what kind of results would come from that? And then finally the last reflection is on the greater picture. So if you look up from your own work into the field of research that you are involved in, how does this relate to the field as such? What kind of expectations and visions are there to the future, and how could these kind of foresight exercises be used to help develop what is introduced in these expectations and visions in desirable directions? Or are you very sure that they're already going in desirable directions for everyone? So that's the first short reflection exercise for you to do. Then once you've completed this reflection exercise, this module also contains a case study. And this is the case study, and you can just pause the recording here and read this case study on the virtual brain. Okay, so once you've read this case study, there are a number of questions that will help you think through the case study. So you're probably sitting by yourself. So to try to think through this case study, we've prepared a number of questions. And the first thing to do is to prepare a short overview of key aspects of this case. So including what are the promises of the technology, what are the technological uncertainties, and what are the scientific discussion on the vision. How could this virtual brain be applied in practice? Who would have to do what to make it work? So this is really about reconfiguration again on social practices around the technology, and how would that differ from current practice? How do you think this could impact patients, families, or caregivers, or society? What possible future trajectories could you think of? And in your professional experience, do ethical and social issues arise? When and why? And so this is a case study and questions for you to do for yourself. Now we come to the end of this module, and here I just would like to share with you a few resources that you can visit for further information and development. So the first is a collection of ethics and society training resources that is on the website of the Human Brain Project. There is a collection of teaching modules on responsible research and innovation, and there are really a lot of different modules on themes such as dual use and data governance. So please go there and have a look. And then the second resource that I would like to draw your attention to is what we call the Ethics and Society Toolkit. And in that toolkit you can find really practical exercises to help you plan possible activities of engaging with users or different kinds of audiences in reflection exercises, or think through gender and diversity issues, for example. And then finally, go to the eBrains website and visit the eBrains community space and sign up there if you're interested in keeping in touch in the future. And with that, there's just left for me to say thank you. I hope that you enjoyed this module. My name is Lise Bitsch, and I can be reached at lb@techno.dk, and my colleague Aline Sales can be reached at asales@instituteofneuroethics.org. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.